two people walk into the same room, face the same problem, have access to the same information, and walk out with completely different futures. And the only thing that was ever different between them was not what they saw, but how their brain processed what they saw. What meaning they assigned to it, what action that meaning compelled them to take, and what story they told themselves about who they are in relation to that problem. That is the entire game. That is the whole difference between the person who builds something extraordinary and the person who spends their life wondering why extraordinary things never seem to happen to them. And today we are going to go surgically deep into the neuroscience, the psychology, and the lived behavioral patterns of people who consistently produce exceptional results. Not because they were born different, not because the universe handed them something it withheld from you, but because somewhere along the way, consciously or through environment, they developed a set of cognitive habits that most people never examine, never practice, and never even realize exist. So if you have ever looked at someone wildly successful and thought, what do they have that I don't? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will have a precise, science-backed answer to that question. And more importantly, you will know exactly what to do about it. Let's begin with the foundational cognitive difference that underlies virtually every other pattern we are going to discuss today. And that is the way successful people process reality itself. Most people are reactive thinkers. Something happens in the external world, and the brain immediately generates a response based on habit, emotion, and past conditioning. There is no gap between stimulus and response. The event arrives, the feeling arrives, the behavior follows. But successful people, and this is documented extensively in research on high performers across fields, as diverse as elite athletics, entrepreneurship, military leadership, and the arts, have trained themselves to insert a deliberate pause between what happens and how they respond. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, called this the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose your response to any given stimulus. And that pause, that tiny but infinite space between what happens and what you do next, is where all exceptional outcomes are born. Because in that pause, the successful person is not just reacting, they are evaluating, they are asking, what is actually happening here? Separate from my emotional interpretation of it, what are my options? What response will serve my long-term goal rather than my short-term emotional comfort? And what kind of person do I want to be in this moment? These are not questions that average thinkers ask automatically. They are questions that successful thinkers have trained into their cognitive default settings through years of deliberate practice, journaling, mentorship, and radical self-examination. Now, let's talk about how successful people relate to problems, because this is where the cognitive divergence becomes most visible and most dramatic. The average thinker experiences a problem as an obstacle, something that has been placed between them and their desired outcome, something to be endured, complained about, or waited out. The successful thinker experiences a problem as a signal, and more specifically, as a signal that contains within it the precise information needed to move forward. Jeff Bezos, in multiple interviews, described his philosophy of working backwards from the customer's problem, treating every complaint, every friction point, every failure as data that pointed directly toward the next innovation. Elon Musk has spoken extensively about first principles thinking, the practice of breaking any problem down to its most fundamental truths rather than reasoning by analogy from what has already been done, because analogical reasoning inherits the limitations of the past, while first principles thinking is unconstrained by what has previously been considered possible. And these are not just the habits of billionaires. Cognitive research consistently shows that people who reframe problems as information rather than obstacles demonstrate higher persistence, higher creativity, higher emotional resilience, and dramatically better long-term outcomes across every domain studied. The brain, when it perceives a threat, narrows its cognitive field. This is the well-documented fight or flight response, which floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline and shifts neural resources toward immediate survival rather than creative problem solving. But when the brain perceives a challenge rather than a threat, same situation, different cognitive label. It activates what psychologist Barbara Fredrickson calls the broaden and build response, expanding awareness, increasing the number of options the mind can generate, and building psychological resources that compound over time. Successful people have learned through practice and mindset cultivation to trigger the broaden and build response where most people trigger threat response. And that single cognitive shift produces a measurably, dramatically different quality of thinking in identical situations. Let's now examine how successful people think about time, because their relationship with time is profoundly and functionally different from the average person's, and this difference alone explains decades of diverging outcomes. Research on delayed gratification, most famously the Stanford marshmallow experiments conducted by Walter Mischel, demonstrated that the ability to resist immediate reward in favor of a larger future reward was one of the strongest predictors of life outcomes ever identified, correlating with higher academic achievement, better health outcomes, stronger relationships, and greater financial success decades after the original test. But what's less discussed about this research is that the ability to delay gratification is not purely a willpower phenomenon. It is a trust phenomenon. Children who had been in reliable, trustworthy environments, where adults kept their promises and rewards actually materialized when expected, were far more likely to wait for the second marshmallow. Children in unreliable environments had learned rationally that the future is untrustworthy. So, you take what's available now. This means that the capacity for long-term thinking that characterizes successful people is partly a function of having developed trust in the future. Trust that effort compounds. Trust that consistency pays off. Trust that delayed investment will produce delayed return. And building that trust is itself a habit. It is built through small, repeated cycles of committing to something, following through, and experiencing the result, which trains the brain to believe that the future is real, reliable, and worth planning for. Successful people live in a longer time horizon than most. They make decisions today based on who they want to be in 10 years, and they have the psychological infrastructure built through years of smaller, kept promises to themselves to maintain that orientation even when the short term is uncomfortable. Now let's talk about the relationship between successful people and discomfort, because this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of high-performance psychology. Popular culture tends to portray successful people as exceptionally motivated, as people who wake up every day burning with passion and enthusiasm, and never struggle to take action. This is almost entirely false. What the research actually shows, in studies on elite performers by psychologists like Anders Ericsson, who developed the concept of deliberate practice, and Angela Duckworth, whose work on grit became one of the most cited bodies of research in modern psychology, is that high performers don't experience less discomfort than average performers. They experience the same discomfort, the same resistance, the same self-doubt, the same fatigue, the same desire to stop. The difference is in how they interpret that discomfort. The average thinker interprets discomfort as a stop sign, a signal that something is wrong, that this path is incorrect, that they should retreat to familiar ground. The successful thinker interprets discomfort as a directional signal, a confirmation that they are at the edge of their current capability, which is precisely where growth happens. They have learned to chase their discomfort rather than flee it because they understand at a deep cognitive level that comfort is the enemy of expansion, that the version of themselves they are trying to become lives on the other side of the resistance they feel right now, and that every moment of sustained discomfort is depositing compound interest into their capability account that will pay returns for the rest of their life. This cognitive reframe from discomfort means stop to discomfort means grow is perhaps the single most practically powerful mental shift a person can make, and it costs nothing but attention and repetition to install. Let's now examine the thinking pattern that separates good performers from legendary ones, and that is systems thinking versus goals thinking. Most people are goals thinkers. They identify a desired outcome: lose 20 pounds, make $1 million, write a book, and they focus their energy on the outcome itself. The problem with this, as author and habits researcher James Clear articulates brilliantly, is that the goal exists in the future, which means it provides no behavioral guidance for the present moment. It creates a binary psychological state of either having achieved or having failed, and it disappears as a motivational force the moment it is achieved, leaving the person without direction and often regressing to previous behaviors. Successful people are systems thinkers. They don't focus primarily on the destination. They focus on the process that, if executed consistently, makes the destination inevitable. They design their environment, their routines, their relationships, and their daily decisions to be the kind of system that naturally produces exceptional outputs over time. They ask not, "What do I want to achieve?" but "What kind of person achieves this? And how do I build the daily architecture of that person's life?" And this shift from goals to systems is transformative because it places the locus of behavioral control entirely in the present moment, where behavior actually occurs, rather than in a future state that may feel distant, abstract, and emotionally disconnected from today's choices. Now, let's address something that is rarely discussed in conversations about success psychology, and that is the relationship between successful people and their own ignorance. The Dunning-Kruger effect, one of the most replicated findings in cognitive psychology, demonstrates that people with low knowledge in a domain consistently overestimate their competence, while people with high knowledge consistently underestimate it. And the practical implication of this for success is profound. The people who think they already know enough to stop learning are almost always the people who know the least, and the people who are most acutely aware of the edges of their knowledge, who can articulate precisely what they don't understand, precisely where their mental models break down are almost always the people who are operating at the highest levels. Successful people have a deeply cultivated relationship with not knowing. They are comfortable saying, "I don't know," in situations where the average person would bluff or deflect because they understand that intellectual honesty about ignorance is the only reliable starting point for genuine learning. They seek out people who disagree with them not to confirm their existing views, but to stress test them, to find the flaws in their thinking before those flaws produce costly real-world consequences. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, built his entire investment philosophy around what he calls radical open-mindedness. The deliberate, disciplined practice of treating your own opinions as hypotheses to be tested rather than truths to be defended, which he credits as the single most important cognitive habit in his decades of extraordinary performance. This is not natural for the human brain. The brain is wired for cognitive consistency, for defending existing beliefs because they feel like part of identity, for experiencing cognitive dissonance as a genuine threat. Overcoming this wiring requires not just intellectual understanding, but practiced psychological courage. The courage to be wrong, to update, to change your mind publicly, and to value accuracy over ego, which is one of the rarest and most valuable cognitive skills a human being can develop. Let's now look at how successful people think about other people. Because their social cognition is functionally different in ways that produce enormous practical advantages. Most people engage with others through a lens of competition, a zero-sum mental model in which someone else's success is implicitly a threat or a diminishment of their own potential. This is evolutionarily understandable. In ancestral environments, resources were genuinely scarce, and competition for them was survival critical. But in a modern economy defined by collaboration, networks, and the compounding of human capital, this competitive mental model is catastrophically limiting. Successful people think in networks and in abundance. They see other people's success as evidence that success is available, as a potential source of collaboration, learning, and opportunity, rather than as a threat. They invest in relationships generously and with long-time horizons, not transactionally. Not, "What can this person do for me right now?" but "Who is this person? What do they care about? And how can I contribute something genuine to their life?" And the return on this relational investment, compounded over years and decades, is one of the most consistent and most underestimated sources of success in every field ever studied. Research by sociologist Mark Granovetter on the strength of weak ties demonstrated that the most valuable professional opportunities almost always come not from your close inner circle, but from the broad, diverse network of acquaintances who connect you to entirely different worlds of information, opportunity, and access. Successful people build and maintain these networks deliberately, consistently, and generously, not as a manipulation strategy, but as a genuine expression of their abundance mindset applied to human relationships. And finally, let's talk about the thinking pattern that ties every other pattern we've discussed into a single coherent psychological framework. And that is identity-level thinking. Most people think about change at the level of outcomes and behaviors. I want to have more money. I want to exercise more. I want to build a business. Successful people think about change at the level of identity. Not, I want to do these things, but I am the kind of person who does these things. And every action I take today is either a vote for or against that identity. This distinction, articulated most powerfully by James Clear in his framework of identity-based habits, is the deepest possible explanation for why some people sustain extraordinary behavior over decades while others cycle endlessly through motivation and relapse. When your desired behaviors are tied to an external goal, your motivation is conditional. It depends on how close or far you feel from the goal at any given moment. But when your desired behaviors are tied to your identity, to your sense of who you fundamentally are, the motivation becomes unconditional. Because every action is no longer about achieving something external. It's about being consistent with something internal, which the human brain is powerfully, biologically motivated to maintain. So, the ultimate cognitive shift, the one that makes every other thinking pattern we've discussed today not just possible but inevitable, is the decision to begin seeing yourself right now, not as someone trying to become successful, but as someone who is already the kind of person that success naturally flows toward. Someone who thinks carefully, acts deliberately, learns voraciously, fails gracefully, connects generously, grows continuously, and above all, never stops examining the quality of their own thinking. Because that examination, sustained over a lifetime, is not just the habit of successful people. It is the engine of everything they will ever build.